Good morning, everyone. Before we begin with our formalities this morning, with me informing you of the procedure, good morning, Council. Could we just pause for a moment and wish Mr. Albert Philpott happy birthday? Stand, Mr. Philpott. Happy birthday to you, and many, many happy return. Thank you. Yes, this morning we're going to be hearing from Kerb, and I'll just adopt the usual procedure where we're going to ask both Mrs. Winfield and Mr. Riley to be sworn, and thereafter they can begin their presentation. Council, do you wish to say anything?
Well, I rather think each one is going to address their own particular sphere of interest.
Yes.
I understood Mr. Riley was going to speak about the cemetery, and Ms. Winfield is going to speak about more broader issues.
I think in the first instance, Council, they're going to do a PowerPoint presentation, and thereafter they will develop their respective sphere of interest. So we'll just have Mrs. Winfield sworn and Mr. Riley sworn, please.
Just before we go there, Justice, is there a paper version of the PowerPoint?
Let me inquire. Is there a paper version of? Yes, there is.
All right. Before they start giving evidence, I submit the paper version should be marked as an exhibit.
Very well. And so that.
Well, after they identify it, of course.
Yes, quite.
I, Lynn Winfield,
swear by Almighty God
swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you so much. Mr. Riley?
I, Cordell Riley,
Swear by Almighty God
swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Council, we'll have them state their respective names for the record, but we do not need to qualify them as experts.
They are not experts.
They're not experts. So
They are not appearing as experts.
And they're-
They may be experts,
Yes.
but they're not appearing as experts.
experts.
Now, there's one other logistical matter. I'm getting a lot of feedback on the internet, and I suspect that's because various mics are close to each other. So there's a noise factor. The other issue that I have, both Miss Winfield and Mr. Riley have a face mask, which is appropriate, of course, but I wonder if they were socially distanced, then they could take their face masks off and I could understand them better. Because I'm going to have some difficulty understanding either one of them with a face mask on.
all the commissioners' mics are turned off, save for my mic, because I speak from time to time. And then if I'm not speaking or about to speak, I turn it off. Mrs. Winfield and Mr. Riley, they've taken off their mask and they've socially distanced. And for the record, we need to have their names. So if you'll state your name for the record, please, Mrs. Riley. Mrs. Winfield.
Good morning. My name is Lynn Winfield.
Good morning, Cordell Riley.
Yes, and if you could state your positions within CURB.
Yes, I'm the I'm the president of CURB since 2015.
And I'm the vice president.
Okay, so you have submitted to us a statement in terms of CURB's one purpose and then also the purpose of this presentation that you're going to give today. Are you able to elaborate on that for us, please?
I don't have a copy in front of me unless I didn't bring the statement. My apologies. Do you have a copy there? Thank you. Thank you. Okay, thanks. Do you wish me to read the statement?
Yes, please.
Okay, I might read half and give the other half. No? Okay. With this statement to the Commission of Inquiry into Land Loss, Cordell Riley and Lynn Winfield of CURB wish to set the context from both a historical and contemporary history perspective. Understanding what was happening in Bermuda and in other countries around the same time helps bring clarity and greater understanding to the oppression and loss of land for Bermudians. From the arrival of the first enslaved people in Bermuda in 1616 for 218 years, enslavement was endured across 11 generations till 1834. Post-emancipation, another 137 years of segregation, codified in law and culture, was endured across another 7 generations until 1971, when the last law was passed desegregating the primary schools. Pre-emancipation, these oppressive laws, policies, and social rules allowed for the punishment, murder, death, and banishment of enslaved black Bermudians. In particular, black Bermudians, both enslaved and free, were prevented from inheriting and/or owning land from birth to death. Post-emancipation, further laws and policies were put in place for the next 137 years, disenfranchising blacks and poor whites from voting, running for parliament, accessing work opportunities, and preventing wealth creation, whilst continuing to openly sanction and approve racial segregation and discrimination across multiple areas. For example, hotels, restaurants, employment, hospitals, maternity wards, theaters, land, home ownership, funeral homes, social clubs, and churches. During this period, economic violence was the preferred methodology for keeping black people in check, compliant, and subservient. Threats of the loss of one's home, albeit owned or rented, blocked from finding work, loss of employment for individuals and family members, loans and mortgages pulled, all worked to ensure black Bermudians did not rock the boat or rise above their station. This history has left the black community to deal with intergenerational trauma spanning generations, and the white colonial punitive systems of the past can still be found embedded in our society, manifesting in the criminal justice system, education, and across myriad other social and cultural behaviors. The centuries of oppression resulted in a culture of fear and a culture of silence, where speaking about race resulted in quick retribution, punishment, and marginalization. A culture which is only just beginning to be lifted as people seek the truth and acknowledgement about the past, and this commission is an example of that. Today, that history of oppression has serious legacy issues for Bermuda, with social, political, health, and economic ramifications, continuing inequality and inequity, identity conflict, internalized oppression, and the tragedy of individual, collective, and societal intergenerational trauma. Despite this oppression, black Bermudians fought countless battles to overcome their oppression, to achieve and excel. And despite all the barriers put in their way, still they managed to rise. Buried in this oppressive history is a long and troubled history of land denial and land grabbing. in colonial Bermuda. Key features of that history can contribute to contemporary analysis because there are lessons and insights to be learned and derived from the past, and the historical literature on the fate of the land and those who settled it. In the Bermuda context, historical research clearly shows that laws and legislation were manipulated to achieve the personal and economic aims of the oligarchy throughout history and the 20th century. And even today, the threat of economic intimidation still rears its head, with people not being hired because of their political beliefs and discrimination based on stereotypes and biases. The purposeful alienation of land from enslaved and free black Bermudians up until 1834 is a major contributor to ongoing poverty in the community today. The geographical patterns of land division established, the colonial rules and laws of acquisition, ensured access to land was denied, whether to grow food, create a homestead, or ensure security. Stories of land loss in Bermuda are common, and it seems as if every black family has a story to tell or know of someone's experience. Sadly, in many cases, one is told deeds have been stolen or lost by those entrusted with their care, oftentimes lawyers, banks, and businessmen. Many black Bermudians were uneducated around legal matters, and being misled were an easy target. Cases of coercion and pressure are also told, where families were put in a position that they knew they had to sell or suffer the economic consequences of a wrathful oligarchy. Oftentimes, the money paid was below market value. There are stories of unfair acquisition of land for the building of hotels, with Cambridge Beaches and the Southend Princess being spoken of, but all needing further research. Sadly, there is still a culture of fear and silence about speaking of land loss, racism, and discrimination. And there are some who are unwilling to come forward, or if they do, are unwilling to go into the necessary details about their family history, worried that retribution will follow. Even today, people are fearful of losing their jobs if they speak up about unfair treatment or discrimination. As such, economic violence during segregation has given way to economic intimidation today. Many of these stories passed down have little or no proof to back them up, other than the African tradition of oral history being passed down in families. But what is important is that these stories are told and recorded. So the systemic nature of land loss from one end of the island to the other is recorded, and the extent of the loss documented for future generations. We present to the Commission today the book, Black History in Bermuda, a timeline spanning 5 centuries, which is This timeline contains a bibliography of both books and electronic links to the citations contained therein. We have also provided this timeline in PDF form and in the form of an online link, which is fully accessible by everyone, by anybody who wishes to see it. We feel the documents are so important. Today's PowerPoint presentation to the Commission will provide an overview of the timeline and contains evidence of the oppression and legislative denial of access to land and property, and the ability to earn money. It is hoped that in understanding the broader context of white supremacy in Bermuda, the loss of land in both historic and contemporary history is more clearly understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Justice, before we go any further, can you hear me?
Yes, Counsel.
Before we go any further, I mean, I hear Kurt for what it is. And my concern is that what we have just heard is nothing short of opinion evidence. And therefore, it's not factual, it's conclusory. Now, I have no difficulty this being before the Commission, because frankly, I think the Commission wants to have it. But, and even if I objected, I would be overruled. Having regard to the kind of questions I've heard in the last few days, I have a fairly good sense where the mind of the commission is. Having said that, if this commission is going to proceed on facts rather than unsubstantiated opinions, then the record should show that what we have is opinion evidence without the witness having been qualified as an expert. So I just want to put that caveat on the record because I think if we are going to have any regard for the rules of evidence, then clearly what we have here today is inadmissible.
I've heard what you've had to say, Counsel, and I'll ask Kerb to proceed. Obviously, this is an inquiry, and I think the public wishes to hear everything. And once we have everything on the record, it is for them to make up their minds as to what they accept or not. I've heard it often said that we need to have the dialogue, and I think this is part of the dialogue.
As I said, I'm not raising a formal objection, but I do want the record to show two things. Firstly, the nature of what we've heard. I expect what we are about to hear is in the nature of opinions rather than facts. And secondly, the opinions are presented by witnesses who have not been, and I suspect cannot be, qualified as experts.
Quite.
And thirdly, if I may, Justice, when you look at the terms of the inquiry, it doesn't present facts that will assist the commission to make a determination whether or not in fact, and I underscore in fact, there has been a theft, unlawful or irregular dispossession, unlawful or irregular adverse possession, or other unlawful or irregular acquisition of land. What we are about to hear doesn't give any factual underpinnings to those findings, and therefore they are not relevant.
Quite.
As a background, as I said, having heard the kind of questions that I've heard from the commission, I have no mind, I have no doubt where this commission is going. But
Counsel, could we have this discussion elsewhere? Because I think it's not serving us any useful purpose to be airing it to all of Bermuda public if you're having that opinion. Certainly, all the commissioners are well-educated individuals, and they will know how to assess fact from fiction and what meets their mandate and drop it. But we're having the dialogue.
well, Justice, I hear what you're saying, but my role as Commission Counsel is to represent the public interest. And the public interest in Bermuda includes both black and other members of Bermuda.
Yes,
So
and
therefore-
you've had your say, but I think it is inappropriate for you to say that the commissioners have made up their mind already. You know where they're going.
Well, I have a level of concern, ma'am.
Okay. All right, let us continue. Mrs. Winfield and Mr. Riley, if you continue with your presentation, please.
Okay, if we could have the presentation up so people can see the presentation.
1 second, just before we get to the presentation.
Yes.
If you look to your left on the screen, you will see.
And I've also got a copy right here.
No, I was going to show them the documents, right? List of documents. So initially, if you look first on your left-hand side, you provided us with some documentation.
Yes.
If you can take a look at the screen and just confirm that that is the documents that you have sent to the commission.
Yes.
And those documents are going to be documents that you're going to refer to in some capacity through your presentation?
Not all of them, but some of them, but we will presenting them all as evidence. But we don't have the time to address every single document.
Understandable. Just wanted to ascertain that those were going to be the documents.
Yes.
So, Justice, if these could be exhibited as CARB documents 1.
And included in that is the document I presented earlier this morning, which is not included up there, and the PowerPoint presentation. So the document that I handed over this morning was Bermuda's immigration history, race, and the quest for votes.
And that's a document that you'll be forwarding to us
Yes,
later today?
the commission has a copy.
Yes, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Justice, is that okay for that to be Exhibit 1 for CURB?
So the
Sorry?
PowerPoint will be Exhibit 1?
The PowerPoint will be Exhibit 2.
Yeah.
But first,
Okay.
this list of documents and...
Exhibit 1.
Exhibit 1, thank you, Justice.
Curb Exhibit 1.
CURB Exhibit 1, yes, please.
Tell me, please, in terms of the document that was read in, Mr. Swan, shouldn't that be Exhibit 1?
Yes, sorry, yes, Justice, that is correct,
This
yes.
is Exhibit
So
2.
the document is the precursor to the CURB report. I will get the exact...
What is the document called, Mrs. Winfield?
I think it was called the statement, I think I did it up
Just
here.
give me the correct,
Here we go, I got it. Statement to the Commission of Inquiry into Historic Land Losses in Bermuda by Cordell Riley and Lynn Winfield. Today's date, and that's basically it. It's the statement.
So yes, Justice, the CURB statement would be CURB Exhibit 1.
and that's Exhibit 1.
Yes, and then we would exhibit the list of documents and the documents therein as Exhibit 2.
And if you'll put that up for me, please, Mrs. Winfield? The name.
Oh, the name, which was the
So I
document?
can look at the
Which
name of
ones?
Exhibit 2, the
Was
next
the
document
PowerPoint?
that you're putting in.
Oh, sorry, yes, Justice, that's the whole list of exhibits. So it's multiple documents that are there. A collection of documents on behalf of CURB.
I'll get it later, I just put curb
Grateful,
Exhibit
Justice.
2. Go ahead, please.
Okay, and then if you both take a look at the screen to your right, the screen in front of you, it would have your PowerPoint presentation, is that correct?
That's correct.
And if you could, we will then go through this PowerPoint presentation. Justice, we would like to have the CURB presentation to the Commission of Inquiry listed as Exhibit 3.
Black History in Bermuda, a presentation. Is that our Exhibit 3 or
Yes, that is correct, yes, Justice.
curb 3?
So now with the formalities, if you would like to proceed with your presentation, if there will be any documents that you would like for the commissioners to have a look at, please let us know and we can exhibit them on the screen to your left, which will then help the process a bit easier for you.
Yeah. I do just want to speak to the Council Whitehall's comment concerning expertise. I acknowledge, if that's permissible,
Yes, go
I
ahead.
acknowledge what the Council says, that neither Cordell Riley or I have degrees in history in any regard. We have been involved in doing this work for 15 years now, but particularly I want to draw attention to the fact that we have history books which have been written by amateur historians who have not also had books nor degrees in history, yet their work has been fully accepted as being completely acceptable to the community and has been used on a constant basis. I can give the names of the authors of those history books, but I will leave it to the council if they wish to ask me at a later date if they would like to have the names of those individuals.
Okay, that's fine for the time being.
Thank you.
Okay. If you want to go ahead and proceed with the presentation, that would be fine at this point.
Good morning,
Ms. Riley.
commissioners, council. Perhaps we don't have the expertise. Oh, it's on, but okay. I've got to move closer. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good morning, councilors and commissioners. Yes, we would like to begin our presentation. Perhaps we don't come with the degree or the subject matter expertise with credentials, but certainly our records show that we come with credentials and we come with a certain level of expertise. And on that basis, we shall proceed.
Grateful.
So this commission has been on a journey, and one that has the aim of unearthing a past racial injustice, land theft. We see our role here today as setting the historical and legal context that not only created but sanctioned the environment of the crime to take place. In addition, we shall highlight some of the current manifestations of a society still steeped in structural racism. We also offer some recommendations that deal mostly with the Tuckerstown gravesite. Nelson Mandela remarked that it is a long walk to freedom, and Confucius reminds us that a journey of 1,000 miles must begin with one step. Let us continue this journey. So here's a short timeline of Bermuda's history. If we go back to 1609, when there was the first shipwreck by the Sea Venture, and then the settlement in 1612, and then by 1616, you have the first slaves being brought, or the first indentured servants who came here to die for pearls. And by 1623, you had the first laws banishing blacks from engaging in commercial activity. And so we're going to go through that timeline, a brief walk through that timeline to set the stage for historical and the legal context in terms of oppression, which gave the environment for things such as land grabs to take place. In 1834, the enslaved were freed, if I can use that term loosely. And by 1959, we still were going through a form of segregation, and we had a theater boycott. In 1971 is the last vestige of a law that was removing segregation, where the primary schools in Bermuda were segregated. And so if you mark that as the period of quote-unquote freedom for blacks, then we've only had 50 years of freedom. All of these things are facts and not opinions. We want to set the stage with a definition. Structural racism is a system of maintaining benefits for one race, and that is allowed to endure and adapt over time. And this enduring and adaptation over time means that it's hard to see. When people say, why, how can you call that racism? There's no evidence of racism. That is because it's allowed to endure and adapt over time, and it becomes normalized. It usually manifests itself, as Ms. Winfield stated earlier, in terms of various outcomes in different domains, such as education, such as the criminal justice system, such as income and housing, and the like. Once you have this form of structural racism, it sort of permeates through life, and it's sustained over time. Faced with the collective forgetting, we must fight to remember. If it's become normalized, we tend to forget. That's why we have to fight to remember. So I'm going to turn it over to
I'll let you do it. Thanks.
to Ms. Winfield.
Thank you. You can put it on.
Okay. Go ahead. You can start.
Okay, so Cordell has already mentioned 1609 and 1612, and 1616, when the first people of color arrived. That was a Native American Indian from the Caribbean, as well as a black person who arrived in Bermuda. There is a substantial argument now to say that they were not indentured servants, they were in fact enslaved. Going on, I'm not going to mention most of the items that are highlighted in black, because they're there to give you context, but we're really going to talk to the various acts and things that were passed, legislation that was passed. We've given citations and references, as you can see, to Cyril Packwood's work. Chained on the Rock is the name of his book, and to, I'm just trying to remember her first name, Victoria Bernhardt's book, Slavery and Slaveholders, and Cyril Packwood's book, I've mentioned that one, and Kenneth Robinson, who wrote Heritage. So these two particular ones highlighted in red, the 1623, an act to restrain the insolences of the Negroes, that is mentioned in Cyril Packwood's book, and it was basically, as Cordell said, forbidding black people, both free and enslaved, from buying, bartering, and selling. Now, why don't we mention this? Because you must realize that in this context, this basically means you cannot create equity. There is no way you can create equity in order to either purchase your own freedom or in order to buy land or anything like that. So there was a constant effort through legislation throughout our history to prevent black people from creating equity. And this was one of the major ways that the land denial came about, both during slavery and later. 1626, again, Cordell mentioned this. Chattel slavery was established by decree of no, he didn't mention this one. He mentioned the 1623. Sorry, 1626, chattel slavery was formally established by decree of Governor Woodhouse. We also happen to have this first ever piece of legislation, a decree rather, that was placed on our books prior to most of the colonies in the British Northern Hemisphere, in the British colonies. So we have the notoriety of that fact, and also the notoriety of being the first country in the Northern Hemispheres to actually place a law on the books in 1623, specifically targeting black people. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Again, constantly we have this myth in Bermuda that there was no, that slavery was benign and that Bermudians were happy with their lot. And there are so many examples throughout our history that are fully documented showing that there were constant conspiracies, planned uprisings, and even one almost revolution, and we'll speak to that one in a little while. So this myth, we hope that this presentation will dispel very quickly. You can see 1663, miscegenation was prohibited, and 64, I will mention this one, you will see that the governor forced all free blacks on the island to leave. Now, this is something that is repeated constantly throughout our history until 1834. This constant effort to reduce the number of black people on the island repeats itself. And you will see in legislation that we will cover and mention that it's even talked about that there were far too many black people on the island. And so quite often people in Bermuda wonder why our demographics do not compare with that of the Caribbean, which is far greater black, approximately 95% I can't give you the specific numbers, but that's very easy to Google if you wish to follow through on that. But if we're wondering why Bermuda has 30% white Bermudians and 70% black Bermudians, we must understand that this was planned. This was a process that was carried out throughout our history, initially through this banishment of free blacks and later through other methodologies, which we will cover. By 1673, there was another uprising. Now, this one, 1675, an act prohibiting the importation of slaves. This is in Michael Jarvis's book, In the Eye of All Trade. That act specifically wanted to stop slaves coming in the island. It was not to do with feeling that it was wrong to enslave people. It was basically because of this worry about demographics. And this is mentioned in Michael Jarvis's book. We go on to 1690, an act to prevent buying, selling, and bargaining with slaves. Again, here we have another example, and this is fully documented in the Black History in Bermuda timeline, the source for all of these things. So the act to prevent buying, selling, and bargaining with slaves was passed, and that act, again, prevents people from accessing equity. So we go on to the 1700s. 1704, an act to legislate the punishment for the insolence of. Fortunately, the British government intervened very rapidly and told the Bermuda government that that was not on the board. The act was okay, but that particular clause had to be removed. And this was basically to punish Negroes for all manners of small crimes that today we would be horrified by. But it was the law of the day. 1705, again we have in James Smith's book, Slavery in Bermuda, forced banishment of all Negroes. And this, again, was a worry about the demographics that black Bermudians were increasing by natural means in the island, and they were worried that importing more blacks was a grave concern. Also, free Negroes basically were a competition for poor whites, or those who were, I guess we would call them today, middle class. They were artisans. They were builders. They built St. George's. If you look at St. George's, everything there was built by enslaved people, including furniture, pulpits and churches across the board. St. George's is a town that has been built by enslaved people. Then we go on to the poison plots. This is something that's huge in our history and includes Sally Bassett being burned at the stake, which ended the poison plots. The poison plots were about enslaved people desperately trying to rebel in whatever way they could. And this was a way to rebel and resist their enslavement. So again, the mythology of benign slavery and the mythology around the fact that enslaved blacks were happy with their lot is really, with the facts that are produced, shows you that this was not the case. 1729, an act to prevent home meetings. They were worried constantly about black people planning things. And again, you see in 1730s, Sally Bassett, who was burned at the stake, free blacks were banished or sold into slavery. They were threatened with, if they did not leave, they would be re-enslaved. 1743, an act to prevent buying, selling, or bargaining with Negroes, that's free blacks and slaves. So again, this constant effort to deny access to equity and wealth to one group of people. This is all fully legislated. 1755, this particular one was basically if you happen to kill somebody while you're punishing them, that was okay. 1779, no retailing for blacks, whether enslaved or free. Again, you see this constant effort. And please remember that this is only part of what we have in this publication, which you can find online, Black History in Bermuda. If we go on to the next one. Thank you. Excuse me. Many of us know about Mary Prince and her life story. Her book has been mentioned just recently, and her work has been mentioned in the British House of Parliament. Mary Prince grew up in Bermuda and was enslaved here, and at the age of 14, when she was sold to Captain John Ingham, she witnessed the murder of a young woman, young pregnant woman called Hetty, who was basically beaten to death. 1806, an act to prevent blacks from owning and inheriting land. Again, we continually see this effort to prevent the acquisition of equity and property. And also an act was passed to tax all free blacks in the what it was referred to in Kenneth Robinson's book as the mechanics trades. That's basically artisans, people who are in joinery, coopering, which was the making of barrels, and so on and so forth. Masons who built houses, as well as artisans that produce furniture and things like that. Free blacks were the artisans of the country, and they knew what their slave owners were charging. More often than not, their slave owners would receive the money from the free blacks themselves. They'd bring their salaries or their wages home with them and hand them over to their slave master. So they knew what they were earning at this time. 1807, you have the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, and then you saw the British Navy start to try and stop, as best they could, the slave trade, which did continue despite an act. And as we know, that even though you introduce legislation, it's not followed, and smuggling continues despite any legislation that's put in place. We go on to, I'm going to go to this point. Would you like to speak to this point, Cordell, on the demographics?
Yeah, so just prior to 1834, you notice that the total population in Bermuda was just under 10,000 or just over 9,000. But what was striking here was that if you combine the slaves and the free blacks, there were more blacks than whites. And that's important to note because in 1834, there was emancipation, which meant that the potential for a power shift could take place. The potential, and I stress the word potential.
Thank you.
What is interesting here is that in 1834, and this is very significant, when Britain abolished slavery, the slave owners themselves were paid 20 million pounds, 40% of which it represented 40% of the UK's budget. And they didn't have the money, so they borrowed it through loans and they put up bonds. And in just 2015, 187 years later, that bond was finally paid off. And you see here, this is a tweet by Her Majesty's Treasury, and that's dated February 9th. The reason that was made public was because in January they received the equivalent of a petty request, the Freedom of Information Act. And the person asks how much money was paid and if that money was still being paid, et cetera, et cetera. And that letter was dated, I believe, January 31st. So once it becomes public, then it's people will talk about it. And so what happened is they very quickly on their Friday Facts released this information and basically said, hey, and it says here, today's a surprising fact, millions of you helped to end the slave trade through your taxes. There was severe backlash, and you won't find this on their website, on their Twitter account anymore, because that also meant that if you were black, you were also paying off that slave loan. And so they realized their error and they took it off. But to go a little bit further, there were some 4,000 slaves in Bermuda, and there was 1,000 claims. And you can find that on the British Legacy of Slavery. Their website has all the slaveholders in Bermuda. And that payout was over 50,000 pounds. The average slave was about 12 pounds. Now, to put things in perspective, because I attended one of the conferences of the British Legacy for Slavery in the UK, and they were saying that 15 pounds was basically the annual salary of what we would call a blue-collar worker, a maid, et cetera, et cetera. And so the slave, the average sale of the slave represented quite a large sum at that time. And since it was paid to the slave owners, there were 1,000 claims, as I mentioned, in Bermuda, over 50,000 pounds. So you can see how the wealth would have been built up, and later years, of course, there was no taxes and all of those things on that wealth. You begin to see the seeds of two Bermudas. Okay, you can continue.
Okay. We refer to this as white affirmative action. There is a lot of discussion, and many of us understand what black affirmative action is today. And as you know, in 2007, there was an attempt to bring forward an act around, which could be said to be black affirmative action. It was called the Workforce Equity Act, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But when you look at it in the context of legislation passed in our early history, it was all white affirmative action. And when we call it that, we begin to understand why there is a need today, even though we are a majority black country, why there is still a need today because of the legacy issues for black affirmative action. When you think there were hundreds of years of white affirmative action that came before. So that is put there really to help people to begin to think in terms of what this legislation meant for one group and what the results of this legislation meant for another group. So in 1834, just literally at the same time they passed the act freeing black people and basically stating that they had all the rights of a white person, along comes this piece of legislation in the same breath, an act to fix qualifications for jurors, voters, electors, candidates, and positions of trust. Voting property qualifications were doubled, more than doubled actually in this case, from £40 to £100, and to run for the House was increased from £200 to £400. This was in Kenneth Robinson's book on page 197. And what's of note of this is that it was the first time they'd done anything about increasing prices in 50 years. And the reason was because of the fear of black people gaining power and having the ability to vote. This, in effect, prevented black people from voting for many, many years, or very, very few of them as the years went by. And it took almost 50 years before the first black member of colonial parliament was elected, and we'll talk about that later. The other items, I think most people know about it, and my apologies to the Portuguese community. I do realize that should say the golden rule and not the golden hind. So my apologies about that. Okay. So in 1853, there were protests against government's plan to use taxpayers' money to import Portuguese laborers. As I said earlier, black people knew very well what they were being paid when they were enslaved. And, but despite that, they were not paid the same. And then basically the oligarchy began to look for cheaper labor, something that we see around the world nowadays, where people go and look for other people who are willing to do the same work for less money. And so they reached out and began to use taxpayers' money. By 1855, there was a petition against immigration resolves that would have a negative effect on black Bermudians. Again, this was in Kenneth Robinson's book. There was constant worry that in one breath, the government was talking about overpopulation, and we will have examples of that coming up. And in the same breath, we're talking about immigration and bringing cheaper labor into the island. So it's this oxymoron there. So 1881, this is notable. Only 800 people could vote in Bermuda. This is in James Smith's book.
And I'd just like to add with that, Bermuda has a history of being, at least then, a place where a minority controlled the majority. So if you go back to 1834, when we indicated that the population was just under 9,000, just over 9,000 people, here it is now 1881. I wasn't able to find what the population was around that time, but one can see that it would certainly have an increase, and you had 800 people represent a very small minority, mostly at that time would have been white males. There perhaps were a few black males, but there were mostly white males because women were not allowed to vote at this time. So you had a country that was minority-led.
Thanks, Cordell. 1883, this is when William Joel became the first black member of colonial parliament. If we could go to the next slide, thanks. Nope, I think we jumped one. In 1919, the first trade union was brought into being, and it was basically beginning of a long struggle by black Bermudians to raise salaries and working conditions, which were very dire in those days. And we will again speak to that a little bit later in this PowerPoint presentation. We had a very substantive presentation from Dr. Theo Francis about Tuckerstown and his research into Tuckerstown. I would like to point to the document that we provided to the Commission, which was called The Dominance of White Privilege, the Presence of White Privilege in Bermuda's Dominant Narrative, Tuckerstown Free Black Community, Bermuda 1790 to 1920. I'd like to refer to that one. And that document goes into great detail about the
Could we
Tuckerstown.
pause for a moment? Is that going to be entered as an exhibit, Mr. Swan?
Yes, Justice, that's all part of Exhibit 2, the
Exhibit
CARB documents in
4.
general.
Would you restate the name of that document
Yes.
for me, please?
Sure. The presence
The presence?
of white privilege in Bermuda's dominant narrative.
And if you look to the screen to your left, Ms. Winfield, can you just confirm
That's
the documents?
exactly the document I have here.
Yes.
Yes. This was part of a presentation that I was invited to give to Columbia University, and that's referenced in my bio that I presented to Columbia University on this paper. I think it was earlier than this paper, but this particular one is numbered June 2014. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So there's a great deal of information in that document that I would refer the Commission to with regard to it. It's fully cited. There's a bibliography at the back of the document. And this describes what happened in Tuckerstown. And part of that is also refers to a letter dated 1889, which I think if you could switch to that document, that's, I think, one of the first documents you have in the list. It's very difficult to read.
Yes, I have it.
Okay. Is that? Thank you. It's very difficult to read, and I'll try and do a summary as you show it on the screen. That was written as a letter to the editor on December the 14th, 1880 or 1889. I think it's 1889. And it was initialed by somebody A.O. And he talks about Tuckerstown and what it was like. And I can read that if you wish, or I can simply refer. But basically, if you look at this wording, you can read some of it yourselves. He is describing Tuckerstown, also talks about a visit to Tuckerstown 30 years previously in 1859. And he describes this idyllic oasis of a community in Tuckerstown. He describes the inhabitants of being mostly black and highly intelligent and friendly and willing to show a visitor around. And he was guided around by black people while he was there. He describes the community as lovely, idyllic. Fig trees and lemon trees were growing. Farms were there. The community, because government didn't pay for education in those days, the community had built their own school for their children. They were educating their own children. They had also built a wooden church, which was replaced in 1868. That's not mentioned in here, but it was replaced by a stone church in 1868. And the community was self-sufficient in many, many ways. They would grow things there that they would take to St. George's and sell in the market in St. George's. But this letter clearly describes a healthy, prosperous little community that had managed to isolate itself from the greater community and created a little piece of haven, a haven for themselves. And the only time they would leave would be to go into town to sell their wares, their goods. There were pilots, fishermen, whalers, and farmers across the island. And I know later there is mention in documents that were probably presented by Dr. Francis that later that the land was of no worth, but all you have to do is to drive through Tuckerstown today and through the Mid-Ocean Club Golf Course to see the land was beautiful and verdant. So I would like to submit that as a particular petition to show what the town of Tuckerstown looked like at a certain date and period in time, both 1859 and 1889, the description from this gentleman who wrote in the Royal Gazette. You'll also see on the PowerPoint that the governor at this time instructed the police that they had to recruit white police officers. And up until this time, the police force at that time was completely black, except for one senior officer who was brought in from the UK. However, there was a degree of civil unrest and unhappiness about what was going on in Tuckerstown generally, and the petition that was presented to the government at the time, which has been previously given to this commission. And so the governor thought this was a bad idea to have black police officers, and so he instructed that white police officers be recruited. And within a few years, you saw the police officers completely changed to white, and they were brought in from overseas, from such places as Cyprus, Zimbabwe, which was the old Rhodesia, and South Africa. And it created severe problems between the black community and the police force after this happened. By the 1920s, there was a huge influx of white immigration, remembering that black people were not permitted to be in any way front of house in hotels at that time. They were only allowed to do jobs back of house or labor or domestic. And so as a consequence, they needed people to run the hotels. And they had a huge influx of people coming onto the island. The census results show that, and Cordell will talk to that a little later. Okay, this is about St. David's Island. And so in 1939, a 99-year lease was granted by the UK to the USA for land bases at St. David's Island and Morgan and Tucker's Islands. Only white American civilians were allowed to come into the island to build the bases. There's documentation, and I will refer to that a little later in this presentation. They would not permit black people to come into the island to work on building these bases. The Bermuda government advised the American government, and this was in American historic records. That land lease involved the land being expropriated from St. David Islanders, and 118 privately owned properties home to 65 families were taken. And the majority of those buildings were of wood, Bermuda cedar. Every single part of it was built out of Bermuda cedar. They were old. They had been there, the St. David Islanders, for many, 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 many generations. And those residents who were displaced, similar to Tuckerstown, were fishermen, farmers, and small business owners. And St. David's was actually a center of commercial farming in Bermuda, including Bermuda lilies. So it was a very much, and also there is records of it also being a center for Muscovy ducks, which have been new to many Bermudians. But there was quite a trade in Muscovy ducks, which were produced. They actually helped keep pests off the crops as they were growing, but they also were sold and exported from the island. 1940, the oligarchy turned down the UK funding to finance projects. At that time, there was a lot of unrest in the Caribbean islands, and the UK proposed that they would provide funding to these islands if they would agree to social reforms because of all the civil unrest in the islands. Bermuda and the Bahamas were the only two islands that did not accept funding, preferring instead to do things their way. And despite enormous pressure to bear, they would not accept any money to introduce social reforms and social infrastructure into the island. And as you can see there, this is in 1940. There was no Trade Union Act, no compensation for workplace injury, no minimum wages, no child labor laws, no pensions, no labor dispute conciliation, and no reduction in the 54-hour work week. Thank you, Cordell. This created in 1944 the Bermuda Workers Association formed, which very quickly turned into the Bermuda Industrial Union, which was really the foremost methodology that blacks had to bring pressure to bear to effect change. And when you don't have power in any form whatsoever, the only power you have is your labor. then you have to bring your labor to bear in order to get basic core human rights. And so this is what occurred with the introduction of the Bermuda Industrial Union. They brought about all sorts of things today that we benefit from, such as vacation pay, sick leave pay, workman's compensation, and so on. And it was their pressure groups and their work that brought about those changes on our island. Here you see another one, 1945, about the importation of cheap labor since World War II. This was in Frank Manning's book when he wrote about black clubs in Bermuda. Since World War II, the aristocracy brought in West Indians as cheap labor, indentured Portuguese, to perform Bermuda's most menial work and to function as a buffer group between the races, accelerated white expatriate immigration as a countermeasure to universal suffrage, and excluded working class whites from privilege while insisting that they keep separate from blacks. That was by Dr. Frank Manning. In 1946, Dr. E.F. Gordon takes a petition to the UK protesting racial and economic conditions in Bermuda. And at that time, he noted only 7% of the population could vote. Very small percentage, and this is by 1946. He said the system gave the moneyed classes a distinct and definite control over the election results. And this was in Ira Phillips' book, The History of the Bermuda Industrial Union.
And I think in 1950, the population was about 45,000.
And only 7% of the adult population could vote. Good. Thank you, Cordell. This is from Stephen Hye's book, who wrote a book called Building Bases in the Western Hemisphere. And that describes a lot of history taken from the U.S. military archives. His work is focused on all the bases in the colonial Western Hemisphere. And he has one chapter in that book called The Jim Crow Island. And that chapter is about Bermuda. And that's the title of that chapter. In that book, it states, ruled by and for a white oligarchy, Bermuda was one of the most reactionary colonies in the British Empire. There was no income tax, no inheritance tax, no luxury taxes of any kind. Property taxes were nominal at best. Without a system of direct taxation, the colonial revenues were largely derived from custom receipts, which we still do today. The great beneficiaries of Bermuda's reliance on custom duties were landowners who paid nominal taxes and merchants who paid none. And the majority of landowners and merchants at that time were direct descendants of slave owners. The great loser, by contrast, were working people who paid the price of higher living costs, as virtually everything had to be imported. So an example today would be you pay $6 for a loaf of bread, and whether you're a millionaire who lives in Tuckerstown or whether you're a person who is extremely poor, you both pay $6 for a loaf of bread. We talk about desegregation in 1959, but in fact it was one-way integration. Blacks slowly made their way into what was previously white-only spaces, but the same did not occur in the other direction. I also want to mention the 1956 Bermuda Immigration and Protection Act, which introduces for the very first time what is referred to in our historical documents as the grant of status. And this particular act also had a clause in it about domicile. I will be talking a little bit more about that later, but I just want you to note that this particular act was very important in Bermuda's growth and demographics. So by 1960, you saw very embedded racialized immigration policies and a concerted effort to encourage whites from the Commonwealth nations throughout the 1990s. This was not uncommon. This was occurring in Australia. I remember myself thinking at one point I was going to emigrate, and for just the small sum of, in those days, £10, I would have been able to have traveled to Australia and emigrated. However, black people were not permitted in Australia, and similar to the US, there were many blocks to people of color from emigrating into those countries. So we saw between those, in that 30 years, we saw very racialized immigration policies, very focused on having whites come to the island. By 1962, a law was passed making it illegal to deny service to black Bermudians in restaurants. This may not seem relevant, but we just want to show or demonstrate that just because you pass the law, or you say that you're, not you pass the law, but just because you say we are desegregating in 1959, didn't mean that it happened overnight. There was a struggle going forward, and so the government had to actually buy, this is an example of a law that was passed basically stating it was illegal to deny service to black Bermudians. By 1963, the Parliamentary Election Act, the universal but not equal suffrage, there was an addendum added to this particular act called the Wattlington Amendment, and this basically added that landowners received a plus vote. And this is why it's not universal but not equal suffrage. Landowners all got a plus vote, and the voting age was raised to 25. Now, this is extraordinary because at this particular time, most countries had a voting age of 21 and were dropping and or debating dropping their voting age to 18. At this time, Bermuda increased, and this was to do with the fact that Bermuda had the black cadre beginning to make their presence known on the island. This was somewhat equivalent to the Black Panther movement in the United States. The black cadre were doing a lot of social work in the island and also speaking out about the continuing discrimination and prejudice that was ongoing. And I think you have a statistic around how many people were disenfranchised.
Well, I think, based on work that Leonie Junis has done, she did a presentation, and the estimate was that that would have disenfranchised about 3,000 young voters as a result of this law.
And that would be majority black, based on our demographics. Thank you. Also, the same year, the 1963, an act was passed called the Commonwealth Voting Act, giving Commonwealth citizens the right to vote after 3 years. And this stayed in place until 1979, and this is in Walton Brown's book, page 103. The Commonwealth Voting Act, in effect, gave my children's grandmother the right to vote her entire life in Bermuda, despite not being Bermudian. And this, as I said, this did affect voting and increased voting because of the sheer number of white people that had been allowed in predominantly during those racialized immigration years. The rest there just describes some of the things that were going on in Bermuda. That 1966 Trade Union Act was one that actually was to try and restrict union actions. This is the book by Stephen High. I thought it worthwhile putting this here. Sorry. Base Colonies in the Western Hemisphere, 1940 to 1967. As I said, much of the research listed in this book is on U.S. military history. So I'll just go to the next page. Thank you. And I'm just going to read something from this. This is one part of the book, which is called The Rise of Jim Crow Racism. There were 3 racial categories in Bermuda statistics: whites, colored, and Portuguese. Whites found employment in white-collar jobs in retail, banking, public utilities, and government service. Supervisory jobs everywhere were filled by whites, and non-whites were barred from the civil service. White Bermudians also owned the farmland. While white residents profited from the shift to tourism, the results were far less advantageous for non-whites. Fully 60% of Bermudians, numbering 20,000, were descendants of former African and American Indian slaves. Black men were employed as manual laborers on the docks, on public works, and in Her Majesty's dockyard. Others joined black women as low-wage domestic servants in the tourist trade. The Portuguese were brought to the colony from the Azores to work as low-wage farm labor. The strict segregation of races occasioned by the shift to tourism set it apart from other British colonies in the Western Hemisphere. The 1930 Hotel Keepers Act allowed hotel operators in Bermuda to deny service. This innocuous right, however, provided the legal foundation for Jim Crow racism. Non-whites were excluded from tourist hotels, and a segregation gradually extended to virtually all other aspects of life in Bermuda. Time and again, Bermuda officials justified race discrimination as an economic necessity. Were repealed. Only the Bahamas, another gateway for wealthy white Americans, in the Bermuda government was revealed in a file on the illegitimacy found in the Bermuda archives. A December 21, 1940 minute from the colonial secretary, one of the highest-ranking officials in the land, expressed his admiration for the sterilization orders being passed against European Jews. He cited approvingly the case of the Hungarian government that only permitted the oldest boy and the oldest girl in any Jewish family to marry or have children. However, he lamented, "I doubt whether many people in Bermuda would go as far as that with regard to the colored population." A written notation that followed nonetheless suggested that this matter had better come up for further discussion in the Executive Council of the colony. I won't read the last paragraph. I will be covering that in a second. In 1937, Margaret Sanger, who's a renowned birth control advocate, was brought to Bermuda by the government to talk to them about birth control, sterilization, and so on. And she met with them, including the Attorney General and all the members of the colonial parliament of the day. And so they were actively looking at ways to provide birth control, and that was focused on the black community. This is another quote from Stephen Hye's book. "For 100 years," concluded the American vice consul, a small group has made Bermuda its own paradise for controlling legislations and by seeing that taxation policy kept all but themselves in strict economic, subjugation, while they themselves accumulated fortunes subject to no taxes whatsoever. Ruled by and for a white oligarchy, Bermuda was one of the most reactionary colonies in the British Empire. There was no income tax and no inheritance tax, and I've mentioned this before. Without a system of direct taxation, the colonial revenues were largely derived from custom receipts. For over 100 years, the U.S. vice consul in Bermuda noted the attitude of the ruling class, composed exclusively of merchants and landowners who effectively control the legislature, may be summed up in such expressions as, quote, "We may have to give the Negro equal political rights, but we keep him so poor it makes no difference." Thank you. So I'm now coming to a UK Hansard report in June 1967. This was the time that the UK Parliament was debating the Bermuda Constitution in Parliament, and this is recorded in the UK Hansard report. A question was asked as to how many people had been granted status, and you recall that I mentioned the 1956 Bermuda Immigration and Protection Act, which introduced that concept of grant of status. They wanted to know what it was, who got it, and how many people got it. And the response from the Bermuda government was this, that 706 people were granted status under the Bermuda Immigration Protection Act of 1956. 700 were white and 6 were black. And what is extraordinary about that in particular is it's even quoted by, I think it was MP Dryburgh in the UK Hansard report, that it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, and I'm paraphrasing here, it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that the grant of status is reserved for white people. Of those 6 black people, 2 of them went on to be United Bermuda Party MPs. And by 1960 census, if you note here, 3,845 acquired status. You note that's in quotes. They weren't granted status. It's different. And when we did research on the 1950 and 1960 censuses, we came across this figure and couldn't believe what we were seeing. And so we actually made a call to the Department of Immigration and had it confirmed by email, and that is in the documents that we have for the Commission. And we said to them, are we reading this correctly? That the acquisition of status was through the domicile clause that was in the 1956 BEPA Act. And those people who acquired status, did it include people who were married to Bermudians, and did it include born Bermudians? They advised no. Those are people who acquired it through legislation, through the Domicile Act. So buried within that BEPA Act was not only information about what was called the grant of status, but buried within it was a clause that simply stated if you had been here just a few years, you could simply go and apply for status, and you just had to be living somewhere on the. And of those 3,845 who acquired status, 73% were white, predominantly again because of the racialized immigration policies that had been put in place for decades. So this is, I think, what you also have to look at this in terms of that equated. If you add the 3,845 to the 706, that equated to almost 4,500, approximately 4,500 people in 10 years. The majority of those were between 1956 and 1960 through the acquisition, through the domicile clause. And that was more than a 10% increase in the population of Bermuda. By any country's standards, an increase of 10% in your population is, I will be speaking briefly in a document here I have called Bermuda's Immigration History, Race and the Quest for Votes. There is a paragraph that says, there is no such universal international human rights standard that requires states to give citizenship rights, such as permanent status and the right to vote, to long-term guest workers. And remember, these were not long-term guest workers. For example, a country that uses state laws and powers to torture people violates human rights, even if it has not signed the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment of Punishment. The government has failed to provide an example of a small country that grants citizenship rights on a wholesale basis without limits. And this is in effect what it was. This was granting citizenship rights on a wholesale basis without limits. CURB, in this particular document, CURB calls on government to produce examples of small jurisdictions that allow status citizenship without limits. We could find none. In addition to that, the United Nations has some clauses which state that after 10 years residency on an island, not on an island, in a country, that the right to vote should be given to an individual. However, they also have clauses that state that, and I paraphrase again, that in the situation of small jurisdictions, small countries, mass immigration is strongly advised against because it changes the culture, social and economic balance of a country when you allow for mass immigration. So despite the fact that the UN advises that 10 years, after 10 years the vote is given, they also caution about allowing mass immigration, which has occurred several times in Bermuda's history.
Justice, I hesitate to intervene, but how does immigration in any way, shape, or form will assist this commission to deal with its mandate? I mean, this is all very interesting and fascinating and provides a wonderful political platform for CURB, but I cannot see how it will in the long run
Council,
assist.
I think let us take a 15 minutes break, and I will speak to you with the other commissioners. I'll FaceTime you.
Very well, thank you.
Okay.